A millionaire marries an overweight woman as part of a bet and is surprised when, before starting the story, comment below which city you're watching the video from. The grand hall, bathed in the soft glow of crystal chandeliers, pulsed with the rhythm of a live band playing an understated melody. The air was thick with exclusivity, as sharply dressed waiters glided seamlessly between clusters of high-profile guests, business tycoons, celebrities, and political elites. This was no ordinary party. It was a realm reserved for society's crème de la crème, and in this kingdom of privilege, Roberto Silveira reigned supreme. Roberto was the kind of man who commanded attention without effort. Towering and sharply defined, he wore a custom-tailored suit that fit so perfectly it seemed to be part of him. He moved through the crowd with the ease of a monarch surveying his domain, exuding confidence in every measured step, every calculated smile. To Roberto, life was a game of chess, and everyone else mere pieces to be maneuvered at his will. "Roberto," called out Carlos, his longtime confidant and partner in countless escapades, both social and professional. He held a champagne flute in one hand, a mischievous glint in his eye. "Ready for a real challenge?" Roberto turned to him, raising an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. "A challenge? You should know by now, Carlos. I don't back down from those, but it better be worth my time." Carlos chuckled, stepping closer and lowering his voice, making sure no one else could hear. "Oh, it's worth it. I have a proposition, more like a bet. Let's see if you can win over someone who's outside your usual type." Roberto laughed loudly, his rich voice carrying across the room, drawing glances from nearby guests. "Outside my type? Carlos, every woman is conquerable. It's just a matter of finding the right approach or price." Carlos, unfazed, simply smirked and gestured subtly toward the entrance. "Then prove it. You see her? Caterina Marcondes. That's your target." Roberto followed his friend's gaze and spotted her. Caterina had just stepped into the room, moving with an understated poise that immediately set her apart. Unlike the extravagantly dressed women Roberto was used to charming, she carried herself with an air of quiet defiance. Her hair was pulled into a simple, elegant bun, and her dress, though undeniably sophisticated, was far from ostentatious. For the first time in a long while, Roberto felt a flicker of intrigue, not just because of the challenge, but because Caterina didn't fit neatly into his carefully crafted game. And in that moment, he decided this was a challenge he wouldn't just accept, but one he would win on his own terms. She wore no flashy jewelry, no heavy makeup. She was raw, real, and utterly uninterested in seeking anyone's approval. "She's definitely far from my usual type," Roberto remarked with a wry smile, his tone tinged with amusement. "But why her?" Carlos took a leisurely sip of his champagne before replying, his grin widening. "Because she doesn't care about men like you, and watching this unfold is going to be pure entertainment." "And the stakes?" Roberto asked, intrigued now. $5 million, Carlos said, his voice steady. "You have to marry her and stay married for a year." Roberto's laugh filled the room, sharp and confident, laced with just the right amount of arrogance. "Done. Consider it an easy win." 2 days later, Roberto set his plan into motion. The setting? An exclusive restaurant in the heart of the city, meticulously chosen for its air of sophistication. Everything was orchestrated to perfection. Soft candlelight, a live pianist playing delicate tunes, and a table strategically placed by a window overlooking the city's glittering skyline. When Caterina arrived, she carried herself with a calm assurance that took Roberto by surprise. She walked in as though the grand ambiance and his commanding presence were of little consequence. "Caterina Marcondes." Roberto stood as she approached, his hand outstretched in greeting. "That's me." "And you must be Roberto Silveira," she replied, shaking his hand firmly, her tone steady and full of self-assurance. As they sat, Roberto launched into his well-practiced charm offensive. He painted an impressive portrait of himself, highlighting his achievements, his influence, and the lifestyle he could provide. a dream for anyone who dared to imagine such opulence. But Katerina's reaction wasn't what he had anticipated. She didn't swoon, didn't falter. Instead, she watched him closely, her gaze sharp and unyielding, as though dissecting every word he said. "You're very sure of yourself," she said with a faint smile, her voice carrying a quiet strength, almost like you're used to getting whatever you want. "That's because I do," Roberto replied, his composure unwavering. "And I think that could work to your advantage." Katerina leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made him pause. "Let's not waste time, Roberto. I know about the bet." Her words hit him like an unexpected blow. Roberto blinked, caught off guard, but only for a moment. He quickly masked his surprise with a cool smile. "Do you now? And yet here you are." "I am," she said, her voice firm as she rested her hands on the table. "But only on my terms. I'm not interested in your money or your luxuries. If you want to see this bet through, fine. We'll marry. But I keep my independence, my choices, my routines. Everything remains under my control. And after a year, we go our separate ways. No drama, no attempts to turn this into something it's not." For the first time in a long while, Roberto found himself speechless. He studied her in silence, the confident king momentarily knocked off his throne. He was used to women melting under the weight of his charm, but Katerina was different. She stood firm, unshaken by his carefully crafted charisma. "You're straightforward, I respect that," he finally replied, flashing a calculated smile. "But I never step into a game planning to lose." "Then you'd better play it well," Katerina shot back, rising from her chair. "I'll see you at the wedding." Before Roberto could respond, she was gone, leaving him standing there completely thrown off balance. For the first time in as long as he could remember, the reins of control had slipped from his hands. And yet, the challenge only made the game more enticing. The wedding day arrived faster than he anticipated. The small chapel was unassuming but beautiful, its stone walls and muted stained glass windows allowing soft sunlight to filter through. It was nothing like the grandiose events that typically surrounded Roberto Silvera's life. The man who thrived on lavish parties and adoring crowds felt strangely out of place amidst such simplicity. The guest list was modest. Just Carlos, the friend who had started this whole wager, a few members of Katerina's family, and a handful of discreet staff. Katerina had been adamant about keeping the ceremony intimate, dismissing Roberto's attempts to turn the day into a spectacle. "If this is just a game to you, there's no need for extravagance," she had said in a tone so sharp it left no room for argument. She entered to the sound of soft classical music, wearing no ostentatious jewelry or eye-catching gown. Her simple white dress was elegant yet understated, but it wasn't the dress that captivated everyone. It was her poise, her confidence, the way she carried herself. Roberto found himself unable to look away, though the realization gnawed at him. She wasn't playing by his rules. When it was time for the vows, Roberto spoke with ease, as though he were signing a business deal. Katerina, on the other hand, delivered hers with steady resolve, her tone devoid of any emotion that might betray her hand. For the first time, Roberto felt he had met his match. And for the first time, the game felt like something much more than just a game. It was as if she wanted to make one thing crystal clear. She was there for reasons that couldn't have been more different from his. Right after the wedding, Roberto tried to set the tone he was used to in his relationships. He planned an extravagant evening at his mansion, complete with the finest champagne, dishes crafted by a world-renowned chef, and a full staff ready to cater to Katerina's every whim. But she dismantled his elaborate plans with a few simple words. "I don't need any of this," she said, pushing aside the personalized menu. "A salad and a glass of wine will do just fine." Roberto blinked, taken aback. "Don't you want to enjoy it? This place was designed to offer the absolute best." "I'm not impressed by things, Roberto." Katerina took a sip of water, her expression calm but resolute. "I prefer simplicity and practicality. This kind of luxury, it's just not who I am." For the first time, he felt his confidence waver. His usual strategies weren't going to work on her. In the days that followed, Roberto doubled down on his efforts. He tried to win her over with grand gestures, commissioning exquisite jewelry, sending designer dresses, and even arranging a last-minute trip to a private island. But every attempt was met with the same unyielding response. "You're wasting your time," Katerina said as she handed back a velvet box containing a diamond-encrusted necklace. "I don't need things I never asked for." "Katerina, it's just a gift," he replied, his voice steady but strained. "You don't have to make it a big deal." "It's a big deal because you think you can buy me, Roberto, but you can't. If this marriage is going to last a year, you need to understand one thing. I'm not one of your conquests." Her words hit him like a cold slap. For the first time, Roberto felt the weight of the gamble he had made. Katerina wasn't like the other women who had fallen for his charm, his wealth, or his power. She didn't care about any of it, and that realization left him standing in unfamiliar territory, out of his depth and uncertain of his next move. And that irritated him more than he cared to admit. The tension between them only grew when Roberto decided to interfere with Katerina's routine. One day, he announced that she should quit her job, claiming that, as his wife, she didn't need to worry about something as mundane as a career. But Katerina didn't back down. "My work is a part of who I am. I'm not giving it up just because you think it's unnecessary," she said firmly, her gaze steady and unwavering. "You may have control over a lot of things, Roberto, but you don't control me." For a man who rarely heard the word no, Roberto was at a loss for words. For the first time in his life, he felt powerless. Katerina was an enigma, and that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. As the days turned into weeks, Roberto realized that winning Katerina over would be the greatest challenge he had ever faced. She was a fortress, steadfast in her beliefs and completely indifferent to the power and influence he so often wielded. To her, this marriage was nothing more than a temporary agreement, and she was determined to emerge from it unscathed, untouched by his games. For Roberto, what had started as a guaranteed victory now felt like a battle he had no idea how to win. The early days of their marriage had already shown Roberto that Katerina was anything but easy to sway, yet he refused to relinquish control. To him, power wasn't just a trait, it was the essence of who he was. Katerina, however, seemed equally determined not to surrender an inch of her independence. One sunny morning, Roberto decided to try a different approach. He surprised her with an elaborate breakfast spread on the mansion's terrace. The table was adorned with freshly baked croissants, vibrant fruit platters, and coffee served in fine porcelain. Katerina arrived, her serene expression unchanged, and sat down as if she had seen it all before. As she took her seat, Roberto leaned back in his chair, stirring his coffee with a casual air. "I've been thinking," he began smoothly. "You don't need to work anymore. I have more than enough resources for you to enjoy whatever you want," Roberto said, with the easy confidence he thought would end the conversation. Katerina paused mid-motion, her knife hovering over a piece of bread. She looked up, calm but firm, her tone carrying that unmistakable resolve Roberto was beginning to recognize all too well. "I didn't ask for your permission to work, Roberto. And I'm not going to stop just because you've decided it's something you get to control." "Yo, Katerina," he replied, trying to sound reasonable. "This isn't about permission. It's about what makes sense. You're my wife now. There's no need for you to exhaust yourself doing something that doesn't align with, well, our lifestyle." She crossed her arms and leaned forward, locking eyes with him. "You need to understand something, Roberto. Just because you're used to controlling everything and everyone doesn't mean it'll work with me. My job is important to me. It's my decision, not yours." "You're overreacting," he said, his voice steady but with a hint of frustration. "I'm just trying to make your life easier." "No, Roberto, you're trying to shape it into what you think it should be, and that's not going to happen." Their arguments had become a regular occurrence, each one escalating faster than the last. One afternoon, Roberto decided to help by reorganizing the office Katerina had set up in one of the mansion's spare rooms. "I had the staff bring in some proper furniture for your space," he announced as if offering a gift. "The pieces you chose don't match the rest of the house." Katerina stared at him in disbelief, a book still in her hand from where she'd been arranging her shelves. "You didn't even ask me if I wanted to change anything. This is my space, Roberto, not yours." "Katerina, it's just an office. It's not like it's anything that important." She let out a dry laugh, crossing her arms again. "It's important because it's mine. That's what you don't understand. You think everything has to be your way, but not everyone lives to please you." Roberto said nothing, not because he agreed, but because he had no idea how to respond. Katerina had an almost infuriating ability to point out the cracks in his armor, leaving him off balance in a way few ever had. He left the room frustrated, but for the first time, her words lingered, making him question himself. Despite their clashes, Roberto found himself watching Katerina differently. He was used to people bending under his influence, but she was unshakable. No matter how hard he tried, she held her ground, guarding her independence like it was a shield. One evening during dinner, after another heated exchange, Roberto sat silently, watching her. Katerina, as calm as ever, ate her meal while flipping through a newspaper, seemingly unaffected by their latest argument. He couldn't stop himself from asking, the words slipping out almost involuntarily, "How can you be so uncompromising?" She raised her eyes from the newspaper, surprised but no less self-assured. "Because I know who I am, Roberto, and nothing you do will ever change that." Those words hit Roberto in a way he hadn't expected. For the first time, his deeply rooted arrogance was being challenged in a way he had never encountered before. He found himself questioning why he had such an obsessive need for control. Katerina was forcing him to confront parts of himself he'd rather avoid, almost as if she held up a mirror he couldn't look away from. The days passed, still charged with tension, but something subtle began to shift within Roberto. While he continued to push his will, it became clear that Katerina was causing a transformation in him. Her independence and unwavering resolve pushed him in ways he didn't know how to handle. For the first time in years, he started to question the foundation of his behavior, even if he wasn't ready to admit it out loud. For Katerina, their clashes were just another part of the game. She knew Roberto wouldn't give up easily, but she also saw the cracks forming in his once impenetrable facade. To her, even that small victory was worth savoring. One evening, the mansion was alive with light and music. The main hall looked like something out of a movie set, with impeccable decorations and guests dressed in the finest designer attire. It was one of the many parties Roberto hosted to maintain his influence and strengthen alliances. But this time, there was a twist. Katerina. From the moment they arrived, she turned heads. Not because she wore anything ostentatious, but because of how her composed demeanor stood out in a room, saturated with superficiality. Katerina wore a sleek black dress, simple yet flawlessly tailored. Her minimal jewelry and understated makeup didn't shout wealth, but her poise and confidence demanded attention. From across the room, Roberto watched her while entertaining a group of businessmen. He'd expected her to feel out of place, but to his surprise, she looked completely at ease. She was surrounded by a small group of guests, all captivated by her. Katerina's way of speaking was direct, yet effortlessly witty, making people laugh and feel comfortable in her presence. "Katerina is intriguing," one of the men beside Roberto remarked. "She's not like the women we usually see with you. She's got something authentic about her." Roberto forced a polite smile, but the admiration others were beginning to show for Katerina irked him. A part of him felt threatened by how she managed to steal the spotlight without even trying. He wasn't used to sharing attention, and here she was, shining entirely on her own terms. As the party reached its peak, Roberto decided to step in. He approached the group Katerina was with and subtly pulled her aside. "You're making quite an impression," he said, guiding her to a quieter corner. She gave him an enigmatic smile. Isn't that the point? After all, I'm your wife. I thought you'd appreciate it. I do, he replied, though his voice carried a hint of unease. But you should be careful not to overstep certain boundaries. Her eyebrow arched in amusement. Boundaries? Funny hearing that from you, Roberto. But don't worry, I know exactly where mine are. Her words stung, though Roberto tried to hide his discomfort. What unsettled him wasn't just how she challenged his authority, but the growing admiration he couldn't deny, admiration for her sharp mind and unwavering strength. In the days that followed, Roberto redoubled his efforts to break Caterina. He convinced himself her defiance was just a facade, something he could dismantle with time. He planned lavish trips and introduced her to powerful people, crafting scenarios where she might feel the need to rely on him. But Caterina remained steadfast. During one conversation about an exotic trip he'd arranged for the two of them, she cut through his enthusiasm with a simple, unshakable statement. I can't go, Roberto. I have work and important commitments this week. Caterina, you're my wife, he said, exasperated. It was a cold evening and a light drizzle fell softly as Caterina and Roberto sat across from each other at the long table on the mansion's expansive terrace. The air between them was thick with silence, not the comfortable kind, but one that felt like a battleground. This wasn't new to them. It had been like this in their marriage for some time. But tonight was different. Roberto was a man used to being admired, respected, and followed. The world around him spun on his command, and Caterina, his wife, was the one person who refused to be impressed by any of it. She didn't care about his power, his wealth, or the position he held. It was as though, every day, she was reminding him that there was a world beyond the one he had always considered absolute. That bothered him a lot. He felt the frustration building inside of him, but something else was rising too. For the first time, he realized that Caterina didn't need him, and that realization hit him in a way he didn't expect, throwing him completely off balance. The air was thick with tension, but as Roberto sat in his thoughts, he felt an unfamiliar shift within him. That afternoon, while alone in his office, he had tried to analyze what had shifted between them. In all his years, he had always been the one in control. His world had been one where people listened, followed, and did as he commanded. But Caterina, she was different. She didn't bend to his will, and now, for the first time, it was starting to wear on him. She didn't need him, and he couldn't understand why that bothered him so much. Closing his eyes, he leaned back in his chair and exhaled deeply, feeling a strange feeling stir inside him. Was it respect? He had never thought of it that way before. Was that what he felt for her? He couldn't name it, but the discomfort it caused him began to grow. He was used to being the one in charge, but now, for the first time in years, he felt like he was losing control. It was unsettling, to say the least, but it also stirred something he couldn't ignore. As they sat in silence that evening, Roberto noticed how different she seemed. Normally, Caterina was calm, always in control, but tonight she seemed distant, lost in thoughts he didn't know. Her gaze wandered off into the rain-soaked horizon, like she was seeing something he couldn't understand. He watched her for a while, and for the first time in weeks, he decided to break the silence, but not in the usual way. Instead of asserting his presence, he asked, almost with sincerity, "What are you thinking about?" Caterina looked at him, surprised. The vulnerability in his voice was foreign to her. This wasn't the confident, unshakable Roberto she knew. She hesitated, unsure of how to respond, but something within her nudged her to speak, even if only a little. "I was thinking about how selfish choices can ruin lives," she said quietly, almost to herself. Roberto frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" She offered a faint, almost bitter smile, one tinged with pain. "It's not something I like to talk about, but let's just say, when power is abused, it leaves scars that never quite heal." "Have you ever been hurt by someone powerful?" Roberto asked, his voice laced with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Caterina met his eyes, and for a moment the air between them felt heavier, as if both of them were standing on the edge of something they had never dared to acknowledge before. The walls they had built between each other, the silent battles, the unspoken words, tonight it seemed they might all come crashing down. She looked away as if weighing how much to reveal. Let's just say someone's ambition cost me more than I ever expected. My family, my life, everything fell apart in a matter of months. When you watch that happen, you realize how much darker the world really is. Her voice was cold, but beneath it, there was an undeniable sadness that Roberto couldn't ignore. A knot tightened in his stomach. He wanted to ask more, to dig deeper into the story she had only hinted at, but something held him back. Caterina stood up slowly, leaving her wine glass on the table. "Good night, Roberto." Her farewell was brief, but it carried a weight he couldn't shake. In the days that followed, Roberto couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said. The way she spoke about her past without giving much away had stirred something inside him. For the first time, he realized how little he truly knew about her beyond the surface. He began to wonder what had happened in her life that could cause such pain to someone so strong. Roberto was a man who didn't leave questions unanswered. Using his connections, he began to look into Caterina's past. He thought it would give him an advantage, a way to understand what made her tick. What he didn't know was that this investigation would uncover a truth that would change the way he saw himself. As he delved deeper into her history, something inside Roberto began to shift. He began to remember past decisions he had made, decisions that were often made without any consideration for how they would affect the people around him. Caterina, in her quiet strength, became a constant reminder of how he had used his power and ambition to shape the world to his will, without thinking about the wreckage he left behind. A conversation with Carlos from months earlier came back to him. Over lunch, Carlos had casually mentioned the acquisition of a smaller company by Roberto, a move that had led to the bankruptcy of several family businesses. "You were ruthless in that deal, Roberto." "Brilliant, of course, but ruthless," Carlos had said, laughing in a way that seemed to approve of it at the time. Roberto hadn't given it much thought then, but now, the possibility that Caterina's family had been one of the casualties of his thirst for power began to take shape in his mind, like a shadow that wouldn't go away. One night, as he sifted through reports he had requested from his contacts, Roberto found the connection he feared. Caterina's father's company had been one of the victims of his actions. He vaguely remembered the case, a strategic acquisition that had destabilized smaller competitors. At the time, it had seemed like just another power move to him, but to Caterina, it had marked the beginning of her family's downfall. As he finished reading the documents, Roberto felt something he rarely experienced: guilt. He closed the file and ran his hands through his hair, trying to process what he had just discovered. For the first time, Roberto realized that his decisions, those he had always justified as mere business moves, had faces, stories, and lives behind them that he had never considered. The next day, as he found Caterina in the kitchen, chopping fruit with her usual calm, he saw her in a different light. She seemed unchanged, but to him, it was as if there was an invisible weight she had been carrying that he had never noticed before. "Caterina, I need to ask you something," he began, but his voice faltered. She looked up, curious. "Yes?" He wanted to tell her the truth. He wanted to confess what he had learned, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he shook his head, dismissing the thought. "Never mind, forget it." Caterina didn't press him, but the way she looked at him, almost knowingly, made him feel as if she understood more than she let on. As Caterina went back to what she was doing, Roberto realized something that hit him like a cold wave. For the first time, he wasn't just facing the consequences of his actions, he was confronting the very core of who he was. And as he watched her, he knew that nothing would ever be the same after this moment. The silence that hung over the mansion was heavy, suffocating. Roberto had spent days grappling with the truth he had uncovered, but he still couldn't summon the courage to face Caterina. The weight of knowing he was responsible for the collapse of her family felt like an anchor, pulling him deeper into the ground, crushing the arrogance that had always defined him. Katerina, on the other hand, seemed calm, collected, but Roberto could feel the quiet strength beneath her composure, a depth he had never fully understood. She had always been a fortress, and now he was beginning to understand why. Every word she spoke, every gesture, even her resistance to his wealth and power, suddenly it all made sense. She wasn't just independent. She was someone who had survived the worst he had inflicted. That night, Katerina found Roberto in his office. He was sitting in his leather chair, holding a glass of whiskey that he hadn't yet touched. When she walked in, their eyes met for a brief, heavy moment before silence filled the room. "You know, don't you?" she asked, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of tension. Roberto swallowed hard. He knew the time had come. There was no avoiding the conversation now. "Yes, I found out," he replied. "Katerina, She raised her hand, cutting him off. "You don't need to explain. Honestly, part of me even hoped you wouldn't find out so soon, but here we are." He set the glass down on the table and stood up, struggling to collect his thoughts. "Katerina, I didn't know. I didn't realize the decisions I made back then destroyed your family. I'm so sorry." A short, bitter laugh escaped her lips. "Sorry? Does that change anything, Roberto? Because last I checked, my family is still shattered. My father—" Her voice faltered for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "My father took his own life because of your ambition." Roberto froze. He had known his actions caused damage, but hearing those words, so raw and painful, hit him harder than anything before. He reached out, but Katerina took a step back, keeping the distance between them. "Do you know why I agreed to this marriage?" she continued, her eyes locking onto his with a quiet intensity. "It wasn't for the bet, or the money, or the challenge. It was because I wanted you to feel what it's like to have no control, to understand, if only for a moment, what it's like to be a pawn in someone else's game, just like you did to my father, to me, and to so many others." "Katerina, please." Roberto tried to interject, but she didn't stop. "You destroyed the company my father worked his whole life to build. He was an honest man, Roberto. He didn't have the power you had. He couldn't compete with the market manipulations you pulled off." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. Every ounce of pride he had ever clung to felt like it was slipping away. When he lost everything, he lost himself. And my mother? She was never the same again. I had a life, a family, and you took it all away. Her words hit him like punches, each one more painful than the last. Roberto felt his legs weaken beneath him, and he sank back into his chair, his hands running over his face. "I didn't know," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "Katerina, if I had known—" "But you didn't want to know," she cut him off sharply. "To you, they were just numbers on a spreadsheet, small companies, names with no faces. You never stopped to think about the lives that were at stake, because in your world, all that matters is winning." For a moment, silence fell between them. Katerina crossed her arms and stared out the window, as if trying to avoid his gaze. "And now?" she asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "What are you going to do, Roberto? Apologize? Throw money at a problem that can't be fixed?" Roberto had no answer. For the first time, he didn't have a ready solution, a plan to make things right. The truth was, he felt completely lost. "I don't know," he admitted, his honesty surprising even himself. "I don't know how to fix what I've done, but I will find a way. I need to do this. For you, for what I did to your family." Katerina studied him for a long moment, weighing his every word. There was pain in her eyes, but there was also a quiet resolve. "Don't do it for me, Roberto," she said softly, but with a firmness that cut through the air. "Do it because you need to change. Because if you don't change, you'll keep being the same man who destroyed lives without a second thought." She turned and walked toward the door. Before she left, she glanced over her shoulder and added, "I don't expect you to understand what it's like to carry this every day. But maybe, just maybe, you'll start to realize that the world doesn't revolve around you." When she left, Roberto stayed there, staring into the emptiness. He knew nothing would ever be the same again. For the first time, he felt the real weight of his choices. And for the first time, he started questioning who he was and who he wanted to become. The pain he felt now mirrored the pain he had caused, and he knew, no matter how difficult it was, he had to face it. The days that followed his conversation with Katerina were a whirlwind in Roberto's mind. He felt stripped of the arrogance that had defined him for so long. For the first time, the gears of his perfect world had come to a halt, forcing him to face the consequences of his actions. The weight of guilt was overwhelming, but with it came an undeniable urge to change. Not because he wanted to win Katerina back, but because he knew he had to become a better man, for her, for himself, and for everyone he had wronged. The first step was the hardest. Roberto began by revisiting old files and reports on the acquisitions he had made over the years. Each company bought, each competitor destroyed, carried stories he had never bothered to understand. Now, with new eyes, he saw the human impact of his decisions. His first visit took him to a small neighborhood where the headquarters of one of his past acquisitions had been. The buyout had left dozens of families without jobs. As he walked through the area, he felt like a stranger, aware of the wary looks he was getting. He eventually found one of the former owners, an elderly man now living modestly. "What do you want here, Silvera?" the man asked, his voice laced with obvious resentment. Roberto hesitated for a moment, then replied, "I'm here to apologize. I know it won't change anything, but I want to admit that I was wrong. If there's anything I can do, anything at all, to help." The man fell silent, surprised by Roberto's presence, and even more so by his words. Though the bitterness remained, Roberto's gesture cracked open a small door for conversation. Leaving the place, Roberto felt a mix of relief and heaviness. He knew he couldn't undo the past, but at least he could try to build something from the destruction he had caused. Katerina noticed the change in Roberto. She watched from a distance, curious, but still skeptical. To her, it seemed unlikely that a man like him could truly change. Yet something in his behavior began to catch her attention. He was quieter, more introspective, and his gestures, once full of arrogance, had become simpler, almost humble. One morning, as she passed by Roberto's office, Katerina noticed papers scattered across his desk. They were lists of families, businesses, and contacts tied to his past acquisitions. She saw him sitting there, head down, writing something with a serious expression on his face. For a moment, she paused. He looked different, not the arrogant man she had known, but someone searching for a new direction. Later that day, she found him rushing out of the office. "Got somewhere important to be?" Katerina asked casually, though her curious gaze was assessing him. "I'm meeting with some people, trying to sort a few things out," he replied, not trying to impress her, just speaking plainly. The tone was honest, without a trace of arrogance. She nodded but didn't say anything more. She understood that actions spoke louder than words. For now, she would simply watch. Roberto continued his visits, some more difficult than others. Not everyone was ready to hear his apologies, and he accepted that without complaint. There were times when he nearly gave up, wondering if his efforts truly meant anything. But deep inside, he knew he had to keep going. It was a lonely journey, but it was one he had to take. One encounter stood out, with a young mother who had been deeply affected by his actions. She welcomed him with coldness, but her voice trembled when she spoke about losing her job at the company Roberto had acquired. As she shared the struggle of raising her children alone, Roberto felt the full weight of the impact his decisions had caused. He offered financial help, but she refused. "It's not just money that fixes everything, Mr. Silvera," she said firmly. "Sometimes people just want to be treated like more than a number." Her words stayed with him. He realized that the change he was seeking wasn't just about fixing material losses, but about reconnecting with the humanity he had long ignored. Despite keeping some emotional distance, Katerina began to see something different in Roberto. He wasn't making a spectacle of his actions, wasn't seeking recognition or applause. He was simply doing, even though for many, It would never be enough. One night, while they were both in the living room, Katerina broke the silence. "I heard you visited the Santos family today. They lost a lot because of you." Roberto nodded, not looking at her. "They did. And I can never give back what I took from them. But I'm trying to do something, even if it's small." Katerina studied him for a moment before replying, "It's a start." There was something different in her tone, something that wasn't her usual hardness. It wasn't approval, but it wasn't contempt either. It was almost respect. Even though Roberto was still at the beginning of his journey, something in him had already changed. Roberto was starting to realize that the power he had once used to dominate might, just maybe, be used to build instead. And even though forgiveness still felt far out of reach, he sensed he was finally on the right path, a path that for the first time didn't revolve around him. The atmosphere in the mansion began to shift. The tense silence that had defined the space between him and Katerina started to give way to interactions that were less loaded. It wasn't that the tension had disappeared, but something different was in the air. Perhaps it was the fact that Roberto, for the first time, seemed to not only recognize Katerina's boundaries, but also respect them. One afternoon, while Katerina worked in her makeshift office, Roberto appeared at the door, his demeanor calm, almost tentative. He was holding 2 cups of coffee and offered one to her. "I thought you might want a break," he said, giving her a small smile. Katerina looked up at him, surprised, but took the cup from his hand. "Thanks, I really do need one." He didn't push his way into the room as he might have done before, but stood at the doorway, not demanding attention. Katerina noticed the effort he was making, and for a brief moment it disarmed her. "How was your visit today?" she asked, referring to the work he had been doing to make amends for the past. Roberto sighed before answering. "It was tough. Some people won't even listen to me, and I don't blame them. But I get it. I'm just trying to do what I can, even if it's small." Katerina nodded slowly, watching him with curiosity. "It sounds like you're learning something important." "I am," he replied, his voice sincere, "about people and about myself." The exchange was brief, but full of meaning. It was as if, for the first time, they were speaking to each other as equals, without the weight of the past or the shadow of the bet hanging over them. In the days that followed, moments of quiet connection began to appear in unexpected ways. One night, Roberto found Katerina in the garden reading beneath a lamp. He approached her, intending to not interrupt, but she looked up and smiled. "Enjoying the book?" he asked, nodding toward the cover. "Yeah." "Do you know it?" she replied, her voice curious. "I read it a long time ago, but maybe I should revisit it. I think I'd understand it better now." Their conversation flowed naturally from there, and for hours they discussed the plot, ideas, and different takes on the themes. When they finally realized how much time had passed, it was late, and there was something new between them, a connection that didn't depend on games or power, but on respect and understanding. As time went on, Roberto began to see how respecting Katerina's space also gave him a new perspective on himself. Roberto was starting to realize something important. The power he had once wielded to control could perhaps be used to create instead. And even though forgiveness still felt like something far away, he felt like he was finally on the right path. One that, for the first time, wasn't all about him. The atmosphere in the mansion began to shift. The tense silence that had always hung between him and Katerina slowly gave way to lighter, less charged interactions. It wasn't as if the tension had disappeared entirely, but something in the air had changed. Maybe it was because, for the first time, Roberto seemed to not only recognize Katerina's boundaries, but to actually respect them. One afternoon, while Katerina was working in her makeshift office, Roberto appeared at the door. His demeanor was calm, almost hesitant. He held 2 cups of coffee and offered one to her. "I thought you might need a break," he said, giving her a small, tentative smile. Katerina looked up, surprised, but took the cup from him. "Thanks, I really do," she replied, a little taken aback by his gesture. He didn't push his way into the room, as he would have done before. Instead, he stood by the door, not trying to dominate the space. Caterina noticed this effort, and for a brief moment, it disarmed her. "So, how was your visit today?" she asked, referring to the work he had been doing to make amends for the past. Roberto sighed before answering. "It was hard. Some people don't want to listen to me, and I don't blame them. But I understand. I'm just doing what I can, even if it's small." Caterina nodded slowly, watching him with a mixture of curiosity and something else, maybe respect. "It sounds like you're learning something important," she observed. "I am," he said, his voice sincere. "About people and about myself." It was a brief exchange, but one full of meaning. For the first time, it felt like they were talking to each other as equals, without the weight of their past or the shadow of the bet hanging over them. In the following days, unexpected moments of connection began to surface. One evening, Roberto found Caterina in the garden, reading beneath a soft light. He approached quietly, not wanting to disturb her, but she looked up and smiled. "Enjoying the book?" he asked, nodding toward the cover. "Yeah, do you know it?" she replied, her tone inquisitive. "I read it a long time ago. Maybe I should read it again. I think I'd understand it better now." From there, their conversation flowed effortlessly. For hours, they discussed the plot, the ideas, and the deeper themes. When they finally realized how much time had passed, it was late. Neither of them wanted to break the spell of that quiet connection. There was something new between them now, a bond built on respect and mutual understanding, not on power or games. As time passed, Roberto began to see how respecting Caterina's space and her boundaries brought him a new perspective on himself. It was like a mirror, reflecting a side of him he had long ignored. Roberto no longer felt the need to dominate conversations or control situations. Instead, he started listening. And Caterina, in turn, began to lower her guard, sensing that something had changed in him. Although she still kept an emotional distance, the coldness that had once defined their interactions began to soften. One quiet evening, while they were sitting in the living room, Roberto made an unexpected confession. "Caterina, I know what I did to you, and your family is unforgivable," he said, his voice steady but sincere. "But I want to be honest with you. I don't just want to make up for the past. I want to build something real with you." She looked at him, taken aback by his words. There was no arrogance or condescension in his tone, only raw honesty. Still, she remained firm in her response. "Roberto, I see that you're changing, but trust isn't something that can be demanded. It's something that's earned, and with us, that will take time." He nodded, accepting her words with understanding. "I know. I'm not expecting you to trust me right away. I just want you to know I'm willing to wait and to work for it." In the days that followed, Roberto continued to show his transformation through actions, not just words. He started becoming more involved in Caterina's life, but always in a subtle way. Never pushing, just showing up and being there when needed. Moments of quiet connection became more frequent. Casual chats during breakfast, walks through the garden, or simply sharing the silence at the end of the day. Caterina, although still cautious, began to notice that there was something real behind Roberto's changes. He wasn't the arrogant, manipulative man she once knew. And though she wasn't ready to open herself completely, a small spark of hope began to flicker. One evening, while they gazed at the starry sky from the terrace, Roberto spoke of a future he had never considered before. "Caterina, I want to do more than fix the past. I want to build something that matters, and I want you to be a part of that, if you're ever ready." She stayed quiet for a moment, her eyes fixed on the stars. Finally, she turned to him, her gaze steady, though not cold. "I appreciate what you're saying, Roberto," she said, "but there's still a long way to go. If you're willing to walk that path, maybe, just maybe, we can discover something together." He nodded, offering a small, sincere smile. "I'm willing." In that moment, something shifted between them. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, but it was a genuine beginning, and for both of them, that was more than enough. As time passed, Roberto's mansion, once filled with tension and heavy silences, began to hum with a new energy. The interactions between him and Katerina moved from confrontations to real conversations, grounded in respect and empathy. And with each passing day, they inched closer to building something new, something that wasn't just about the past, but about what lay ahead. There was still caution in her gestures, but now there was also a sense of openness. Roberto, for his part, showed patience and humility, traits that once seemed completely foreign to him. One sunny afternoon, as they walked through the garden, Katerina decided to break the silence. "I've been watching you, Roberto," she said. "Not just what you do for me, but what you're trying to do for the people you've hurt." Roberto stopped walking and turned to face her, attentive. "And what do you see?" he asked. She gave a small smile, but her eyes were serious. "I see someone who's changing, someone who's trying to be better, not to look better, but because they truly believe in it." He took a deep breath, as if her words confirmed something he hadn't dared admit even to himself. "I still have a lot to fix, Katerina, and I know not everything can be repaired, but I want to keep trying, not just to fix the past, but to build something real." She nodded, and for the first time, he saw a different spark in her eyes, a mix of acceptance and hope. Months later, one quiet morning, Katerina sat at the breakfast table, holding a small pregnancy test in her hands. She stared at the result, taking in the news. The surprise quickly gave way to a rush of emotions she couldn't quite explain. It was a new chapter, a symbol of something she never expected to happen. When Roberto entered the room and saw her so deep in thought, he frowned with concern. "Is everything okay?" She lifted her eyes to him, struggling to hold back a smile. "I need to tell you something." He sat next to her, and she handed him the test. Roberto stared at the small object in his hands, his face shifting from confusion to realization. When he finally understood, his expression brightened. She nodded. "Yes, I'm pregnant." For a moment, he was silent, absorbing the news. Then a genuine smile, a smile more real than any she'd ever seen from him, spread across his face. He took her hands in his eyes filled with emotion. "Katerina, this is more than I could have ever imagined. Thank you for giving me this chance. I promise I will be someone you and our child can be proud of." The news of the pregnancy brought a new dynamic to their relationship. Katerina began to lower her guard even further, and Roberto, motivated by the new responsibility, intensified his efforts to change and become a man worthy of her. He continued his visits, making amends where he could, and started dedicating more time to social projects, something he had never even considered before. Katerina watched all of this closely. One day, while he was explaining a new project to help families who had lost everything, she gently touched his shoulder. "You're doing a good job, Roberto. I want you to know that." He turned to her, surprised. "Thank you, but there's still so much more I need to do, and so much I need to thank you for. If it weren't for you, I never would have started," Roberto said, his voice filled with gratitude. Katerina smiled softly. "Maybe that's why we're here, to help each other become better, together." Just a few weeks before the baby was due, Roberto made a proposal that caught her completely off guard. He led her to the garden, where a small table was set up with flowers and candles. It was a simple setting, but full of meaning. "Katerina, I know we started this all wrong. Manipulations, wagers, everything but honesty. But now I want to do it right. I want us to be a real family, and I want to marry you, not out of obligation, but because I love you." She fell silent, her gaze locked on his. There was emotion in her eyes, but also the quiet certainty that he was speaking from the heart. "Yes, Roberto, I accept. But this time, no games, no expectations, just the two of us." The ceremony was intimate, far removed from the luxury that once defined Roberto's life. Only a few close friends and some of the families he had helped during his journey of redemption were there. Katerina wore a simple dress, and Roberto, in a modest suit, looked more human than ever before. When they exchanged vows, their eyes spoke volumes, filled with silent promises. It wasn't a fairy tale, but a story of growth, regret, and rebuilding, and that was far more meaningful than any fairy tale could be. After the wedding, Roberto continued working on his transformation. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he was determined to build a future that would be worthy of Caterina and the baby on the way. With each passing day, Caterina felt more certain that she had made the right choice, giving this new man a chance. When the baby was born, they both knew that this tiny being was more than just a symbol of hope. The child was living proof that, even in the most unlikely circumstances, love and change could flourish. Together, Roberto and Caterina turned the page to a new chapter. This time, no games, no manipulation, just love, hard work, and a genuine desire to be better together. Did you like today's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with your friends. See you in the next video.